Every day looks like the weekend now in terms of listening patterns. So we've seen a pretty big shift, but overall, it has been an increase in listening. There's just so much more podcast content now than there was 2 years ago. So all sorts of listeners have a ton of things to choose from.
Hey gang, it's Wednesday, October 6th. Peter and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Newstar. I'm Marcus. Today I'm joined by one of our senior forecasting analysts. His name is Peter Varley.
Thanks for having me, Marcus.
Hey chap, thanks for being here. Today's fact: shaking your head will wake up sleeping body parts. So paresthesia, the clinical term for when your limbs fall asleep, is caused by your nerves being pinched, which restricts the communication between your nerve endings and the brain. So your brain and nerves can't communicate feeling. If the paresthesia occurs in your arms, hands, and upper body, you can usually wake up the appendages by turning your head side to side. I don't know why I just demonstrated side to side. It's a podcast. My mouth just moved away from the mic. It helped nobody. As it's generally the nerves in your neck that become pinched, cutting the nerve communication channels from your upper body to the brain. When your leg or something's dead, Peter, do you, or anyone else listening, do you think to yourselves, why have I let it come to this? Why have I got to the point where it's asleep? Like I should have done something before this juncture.
I felt like that at the office a couple times when I'm the only one in a certain area and I'm just sitting there chugging along and the lights go out and I realize that they're motion sensor lights. So I have to sort of slide back in my chair and do a 360 for the lights to come back on. But it's a bit of a red flag that maybe I should have been slightly more active in that past hour.
Yeah, they're motion censored people. Don't think insider intelligence isn't paying its electric bill. They go out when you haven't moved around for a while.
But yeah, very eco-friendly.
I also panic and think that what if right now I needed to run, maybe if like dinosaurs attacked, what if right now I had to get up and run? I'd be the fool on the ground, crawling, dragging my body across the office, trying to get away because I let my leg fall asleep before doing something about it. But now, just shake your head side to side. If it's your legs, I don't really know how to help you. Just don't let it come to that, okay?
Yeah, don't let it come to that.
Figure it out.
Dinosaurs attacking. I don't know if I've ever heard that one, but maybe.
I don't know why that came. That's the least likely thing.
Yeah.
To be going
Isn't this a tech and media podcast? We could think of something way more futuristic and relevant.
It must be dinosaurs. Not robots, dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Anyway, today's real topic: how people are listening to podcasts differently. So, chap, in this episode, we're going to be talking about how people are listening to podcasts differently, some changed behaviors, and also how much advertisers are spending on the medium. But we'll start with a line from former insider intelligence analyst Marielle Soto-Reyes. She recently wrote, according to Connell Byrne, president of the Iheart podcast network at Iheart Media, there are really two industries underneath this podcasting one: the audience industry and the subscription industry. The subscription industry, Luminary, Spotify, etc., is using podcasts as a lead generator to get you to buy something else that's not a podcast. The audience industry is a very simple business model. Everything we make, we will distribute everywhere. Peter, do you agree that there's these two worlds? And if so, what do you make of these two emerging podcast subworlds?
These two worlds do exist. However, I think that what Connell Byrne is really getting at here is he's describing how Spotify and iHeartMedia are both playing to their strengths in a way. So Spotify has the platform. They have the app, which has tons of subscribers and listeners. iHeartMedia has a huge audience, and they have an app, but they're getting a lot of their listening from other places around the web, on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts and other places where people listen to iHeartMedia podcast content. So inherently, there are sort of two different business models that each of these companies is going after. Spotify with the platform, iHeartMedia with the wide audience and going for the farthest reach possible. But there's a nuance, and that is that Spotify is in both the subscription and the audience game. Because although Spotify has made some podcasts exclusive and they use that exclusivity to try to attract subscribers, they also have a lot of their original podcasts show up on Apple Podcasts and other podcatchers, so you can listen to it. And that's how Spotify is trying to make ad revenue. So they also want to increase their audience outside of the platform. So while there is an interesting sort of difference between the two, it's not entirely mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk listener behavior for a second. Let's start with this comment. So light, quote unquote, light podcast listeners, people who listen to a podcast 1 to 3 times a month, now make up 49%, basically half of podcast listeners, writes Digiday's Sarah Guaglione. In 2018, they made up 39%. So from 39% in 2018 to 49% today in terms of light podcast listeners, that's according to Nielsen data. As light listening has gone up, heavy listening has come down, medium stayed the same. Peter, what do you make of this trend, this idea that people are listening to podcasts a little bit less each time?
I think it does make sense because we would expect the growth to come from light listeners because it takes a while for habits to form. True. And for once you're introduced to a new medium, such as a podcast, it takes a bit of warming up until you're really into it and you start listening a lot and you start realizing how to explore other shows. So it makes sense. We forecast that almost 75% of podcast listeners will listen weekly this year. So we do see that a lot of podcast listeners are listening very frequently, more than the Nielsen study suggests, actually. And that's out of 118 million monthly listeners. So we actually see that frequency overall is pretty high for podcasts. People that listen monthly are likely to listen on a weekly basis.
Yeah, let's talk about those numbers for a second, because we have podcast listener numbers, which are monthly. The ones Peter just mentioned, 118 million this year. That's good enough for 35% of the population. But another figure, the weekly podcast listeners, 87 million, about 75%, as Peter mentioned, of that monthly number listening weekly. That's good enough for about 26% of the population. That weekly number will climb to 94 million next year as the monthly number climbs to 125 million next year as well, going all the way to 2025. What does the picture look like? We expect by 2025, 42% of the population to listen monthly, 32% of the population to listen weekly. Peter, also, the pandemic's played its part, and people maybe are listening, lighter listeners now because they have a little bit less time. The commutes have gone away by and large. And so therefore we saw an increase in listening at home, according to that Nielsen data, 40 to 50% in the last 3 years. So it used to be 40% of people listening at home, now 50% listening at home. Also, the pandemic increased listening. A recent Radio Inc. article highlighted a new study released by Cumulus and Signal Hill Insight showing that among weekly podcast listeners, the COVID-19 pandemic increased listening. So the more engaged listeners, unlike the ones Peter was talking about, those lighter listeners who maybe are just getting into the medium. And the second thing they found was that nearly half of weekly podcast listeners will listen to their favorite podcast within a day of its release. Peter, I went and looked at some of our time spent numbers. According to our estimates, average time spent per day with podcasts, a lot higher than I thought, to be honest. By American adult podcast listeners, it grew 33% last year. It's on track to grow another 22% this year, and it's good enough for 48 minutes. What do you make of that number and some of those growth rates in the last couple of years?
I think what you described earlier is exactly correct, where listening during commutes has just shifted to in-home listening. That's both for music and for podcasts. And as you mentioned, the listening is happening on smart speakers. It's happening largely on mobile still, is where most podcast listening happens. Yeah. But people have just shifted their routines. They're listening to a lot less podcast content in the morning, and it might be more spread out through the day. And it's actually a pattern that Spotify called out early on in the pandemic, where they said, every day looks like the weekend now in terms of listening patterns. So we've seen a pretty big shift, but overall, it has been an increase in listening. There's just so much more podcast content now than there was 2 years ago. So all sorts of listeners have a ton of things to choose from, especially the news category. We've seen that a lot of people are getting their news from podcasts now. And a lot of those news podcasts have actually been shorter format. So we think of podcasts as 20 minutes to an hour, maybe even an episode. And news podcasts, NPR has sort of a standard one. New York Times Daily is another one. They're like anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes. So they're short, quick hitters where people can get their news. That's been really popular in driving up consumption as well.
You talked about all this new content. I can't get this number out of my head. Spotify, every day in Q2, every day, April, May, and June, added 3,000 new podcasts. to its
Wow.
service. So 2.9 million at the end of Q2, currently a lot more, I'm sure, now that Q3's finished. But just the clip at which they're adding shows is incredible. And that's just one platform. Let's talk about shifting routines for a second, Peter. Former Insider Intelligence analyst Daniel Carnahan recently pointed out that whilst total podcast listening time has rebounded from its pandemic dip, the time of day, which you were just talking about, when listeners tune into podcasts, appears to have shifted, notes a new report from podcast hosting platform Stitcher. They found two things. One, the 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and then 5 p.m. commuting times, so the morning and the late afternoon, early evening commuting times, where folks have traditionally listened to podcasts, have changed. And now the top podcast listening hours are in the midday from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., with commuting times capturing a smaller share compared to 2019. And number two, household chores and gardening have replaced commuting as the primary activities that listeners engage in while listening to podcasts. So there's two trends from Stitcher. One, people aren't listening during the morning and the afternoon commutes. Instead, they're listening in the middle of the day. And number two, when they do listen, they're not commuting, they're doing chores and gardening, things like that. Your thoughts on these shifts?
Oh, yeah, I just wonder what the sample is of that study, because it must over-index on gardeners. That, I know gardening is a lovely thing to do while listening to a podcast, but it seems like how many
Who are these lucky people
is that
with
really
a garden?
rising to the top for most popular activities?
Yeah.
But yeah, podcast is one of those things that you can do other things and you can multitask. You referenced our time spent figures before, and those include multitasking. So if somebody is working out at home, we know that home fitness has been a big thing since the pandemic. Listening to podcasts during that is a really easy, non-interfering thing to do. Maybe you're just hanging out at home and like we said, you have it playing on your smart speaker. Just routines have changed a lot, and a lot more is done in the house. And it's really easy to put podcasts on in the background, similar to how people used to listen to, analog radios just in the house, and it would be on sort of all day. Podcasts, I think, have sort of taken that role in the home.
So on those podcast time spent numbers, 48 minutes this year, 53 next year, 56 minutes, so threatening an hour of time spent with podcasts per day by adult podcast listeners by 2023. That is about 10 to 15 minutes more than YouTube, people spend with YouTube each day, and Netflix, that is close to Netflix. Netflix, about an hour a day. Netflix watched by Netflix viewers. So that podcast time spent per day threatening Netflix time spent per day by 2023. Peter, let's finish by talking about advertising for a second. US podcast advertising dollars will cross the $1 billion mark this year. They'll exceed the $2 billion mark by 2023. Your take on where podcast advertising dollars are at the moment?
Podcast advertising is still very much in the high growth stages. As you said, it will pass $1 billion this year and then more than double by 2023. So really strong growth just in the next couple of years. And we're seeing that advertising demand seems to be outpacing supply in a lot of areas. Spotify specifically has called out that they're actually inventory constrained when it comes to their podcast advertising business. So there's a lot of opportunity for ad dollars to keep flowing to podcasts, and a lot of monetization improvement can happen across the ecosystem. Just looking at some growth rates from Q2, Spotify grew their podcast ad revenue 637% year over year, which is insane. And it's a weak comparative from Q2 last year. Remember, a weak comparative, but regardless, still really, really strong growth. And Iheart grew podcast ad revenues 151% year over year in Q2. So the companies that we do have public data from, showing really, really strong growth. And we expect, we won't see those growth rates in the second half of this year, but we will see strong year-over-year trends continue.
Well, that'll wrap up the first half. It's time now for the halftime report. Peter, hit me with a takeaway, if you will, from the first half.
Yeah, so as we just talked about, Marcus, there's going to be over $1 billion in podcast ad revenues this year, and that's going to double over the next couple of years. So that's a lot of money at stake, and there's a lot of players that are competing for that ad revenue.
All right, that's all we've got time for the lead story. Time now for In Other News, but first a quick word from our sponsor, Newstar. Are you prepared for marketing's next chapter? You won't want to miss Brave New World's 2021, the virtual marketing and analytics event of the year. On November 9th and 10th, Join Brave New Worlds to learn how you can adapt to the forces redefining advertising. It's free, and you'll hear from today's top minds in marketing, data, and analytics, including executives from Facebook, General Motors, Capgemini, Publicis, and more. Go to bravenewworlds.newstar to register today. Folks, we are back. It's time now for another news. Today, what do we expect to see from Twitter's ticketed spaces? What is going on in the world of print? And how are Americans getting their news from social media? Story 1. At the end of August, Twitter launched ticketed spaces for some Apple users. This lets folks sell tickets to their live audio events on Twitter called Spaces. They can sell these tickets for between $1 to $1,000. Ticketed Spaces is available to users with over 1,000 followers and have used the space at least 3 times in the past 30 days. Creators get to keep up to 97% of all revenues after platform fees for in-app services. That drops to 80% after a creator has made $500,000 in earnings. Peter, what do you expect to see from Ticketed Spaces from Twitter?
So I don't think anybody knows what's really going to happen with live audio or subscription podcasts or anything in that realm. There's so much experimentation ongoing right now. But I think the most obvious opportunity for ticketed spaces would be among podcast creators or aspiring podcast creators. But those creators are likely incentivized to stream live on the platforms where their podcasts would be distributed, like Spotify or another podcast distributor, for example. So if Twitter's Ticket Spaces is going to succeed, they're going to have to leverage their strengths, which are conversations and community, in order to make the experience unique to Twitter.
Yes, indeed. James Frank of The Drum explains that you could conceivably expect Ticketed Spaces to work for conference add-ons, for premium tickets, or people who can't make the event. Perhaps niche communities having a guest speaker or a celebrity or influencer hosting superfans. Ticketed Spaces could present interesting opportunities for brands to better connect with audiences. Story 2, newspaper ad spending surges while magazines lag. Notes one headline from Rob Williams of MediaPost. Brad Adgate of Forbes titles his piece, "Newspapers have been struggling, and then came the pandemic." So, what is going on in the world of print these days? Well, our estimates suggest that print advertising, newspaper and magazine will pull in just under $10 billion this year in ad revenue. That's 7 times what podcasts make in ad revenue, but print ad spending is heading in the wrong direction fast. That less than $10 billion is down 13% on 2020 and will fall below $7 billion by 2025. Put another way, a decade ago, print ad spend accounted for a quarter of all ad dollars. Today, it's 3%. Soon, it'll be less than 2%. Peter, your thoughts on the world of print?
There's just so many free alternatives on the internet right now. COVID really killed a lot of foot traffic and depressed circulation. So that certainly didn't help print in any way. And now we just get our news from so many different places, including social media, podcasts, like we were previously discussing. So, print just is going to continue to have a really rough time, both from a reader perspective and an advertising perspective.
2 interesting trends in this arena, in my opinion. 1, 38% of Americans still read a print newspaper or magazine at least once a month. That's 100 million people still reading print, even though the ad spending is down to 3%. That is once a month, I should say. That number is flat as well, pretty much, ticking down slightly, that 38% of Americans reading print. And 2, slightly more print ad dollars now go to magazines after magazines overtook newspapers last year in the ad dollar realm. Story 3, in 2021, 48% of Americans said they get their news from social media. That was down 5 points from last year's 53%, who said they turned to social networks for their news. Twitter, again, had the biggest share of users who use its platform for news, 55%, followed by Facebook, 47%, and Reddit's 39%. But Americans are relying less on those platforms for news than they did last year. Peter, your takeaway from these findings?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting trend, what you just mentioned there at the end, where less people are getting their news from these sites this year. We've seen that sort of across the media ecosystem, where news was just booming last year between the election and COVID, and now news consumption is low. So anyone who's in the news business is having a tougher time this year.
Yes, our Daniel Konstantinovich, who's one of our analysts, notes that news content has proved to be lucrative for platforms and attractive to advertisers. And one other thing that jumped out from that Pew research was that TikTok was the only platform that saw an increase in the share of Americans using the platform for news from 22 to 29% this year, last year to this year. I guess you could argue that people are using TikTok more for everything. That's what we've got time for this episode. Thank you so much to Peter.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you to Victoria. She edits the show. And thanks to everyone listening in. We'll see you tomorrow, hopefully, for the Behind the Numbers Daily, the New Marketer podcast made possible by Newstar.